Mr Speaker, I am in regular contact with ministerial colleagues from DESNZ on a range of issues relevant to clean energy production in Scotland. Scotland is key to the UK Government's clean power mission by 2030 that will deliver cheaper bills, energy security and future jobs, which will drive growth in the Scottish economy.
Speaker, the rollout of offshore renewables in Scotland should happen alongside the growth of supply chains there. This is vital if the energy transition is to deliver jobs and investment in Scotland's oil and gas communities. It's welcome that the Government has allocated £200 million to a clean industry bonus, but that falls short of Labour's proposed £500 million pledged in the manifesto. How does the Government plan to strengthen the clean industry bonus to build thriving renewable manufacturing here in the UK?
Secretary of State.
Mr Speaker, it's a very good question from the honourable gentleman, because our clean power mission by 2030 is to make sure that we can deliver that clearly by government mission. GB Energy has been set up to look at supply chains and all the issues around how we deliver that, and I hope that GB Energy is able to look at some of these issues in the round. But the key thing here is to make sure we have the supply chain infrastructure to be able to deliver that mission.
Can members who are just roaming round the chamber remember there's other people and have a little more courtesy? Brian Leishman.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. If the Grangemouth refinery closes in 2025 and the recommendations of Project Willow aren't ready for years to come, then thousands of jobs will be lost. The very definition of an unjust transition. How can the Government possibly claim to have a credible industrial strategy for Scotland if they allow this to happen?
Secretary of State.
Mr Speaker, the closure of the Grangemouth refinery is regrettable. I think the honourable gentleman needs to reflect on the fact that the previous government and the current Scottish Government had 32 years combined to do something about Grangemouth and didn't lift a finger. Since we came into government in July, we've got the £100 million Falkirk and Grangemouth growth deal over the line. We've got some short-term help for the workers at Grangemouth. They continue to work with the company and the trade unions on the Grangemouth refinery, and we look forward to Project Willow coming to fruition this month, and the Government is fully committed to making sure we can see that through.
Yep. We come to Liberal Democrat spokesperson Christine Dardy.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And can I associate myself with the remarks of the Secretary of State, particularly about Dennis Law, whom I had the pleasure of interviewing more than once in my previous career. I also welcome the Government's commitment to energy security as well as green energy and net zero. And I wondered, this week it's been reported that the Scottish Government is potentially going to fund up to £60 million, both Minyang to build a wind turbine factory in the Highlands and Orient Cable to provide the undersea cables and connections for offshore wind. Given that these are both Chinese-owned companies, has the UK Government and the Secretary of State had any discussions with the Scottish Government to ensure that there are mitigating steps, such as ensuring local control and not using cellular modules? And have the security services been consulted?
Stay. No.
Mr Speaker, it's a key question which is one of the top agenda items that we always have with the Scottish Government in terms of how we deliver clean power by 2030, because obviously it's a joint endeavour. The Chancellor was in China last month, and we will work with China when it's in our national interest to do so. One of the key things, of course, is that GB Energy will be looking in the round at supply chains and also how we may deliver that mission by 2030. But she'll be as surprised as I am that the SNP voted against GB Energy and indeed voted against the record budget settlement in Scotland.
Tom Hayes.
Number 6, please, Mr Speaker.
Secretary of State.
Mr Speaker, GB Energy is owned by the public and headquartered in Aberdeen because Scotland will be at the forefront of the UK becoming the clean energy superpower that it wants to be by 2030. GB Energy's activities will support and enhance the delivery of priority supply chains and infrastructure development, helping to speed up the existing Scottish offshore wind pipeline and other clean energy projects.
Tom Hayes.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. 8 years ago, Nicola Sturgeon promised a publicly owned energy company. But now, after spending £500,000 on consultants, the Scottish Government have dropped the plan. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that while Labour ploughs ahead with delivering GB Energy, owned by the British people and headquartered in Scotland, it's the SNP that are breaking their promises, letting down Scotland, letting down our union and letting down protection of our planet?
Can I congratulate my honourable friend on being the new mission champion for clean energy, but he's absolutely right. While the SNP make promises they break, this Labour Government determines to deliver for Scotland, and maybe that's why SNP MPs in this House voted against GB Energy. We are delivering for Scotland, and we promised GB Energy, that's been delivered. We promised to end austerity, that's been delivered. We promised to make work pay, that's been delivered. While the SNP only deliver managed decline for Scotland, we are getting on with improving the economy.
Clear plans for Great British Energy, but there are very clear plans to end new licences for oil and gas in the North Sea. And Gary Smith of the GMB has said that stopping new licences is the employment equivalent of a Grangemouth refinery closing nearly every week from 2025 to 2030. So when is the Secretary of State going to stand up for Scotland, oppose the Right Honourable Member for Doncaster North, protect jobs and ensure we don't have more imports with higher emissions?
Mr Speaker, GB Energy is there with the National Wealth Fund to deliver that just transition and clean power by 2030. Oil and gas in the North Sea will be here for decades to come, and I would ask the honourable gentleman to work with us to deliver that just transition rather than scaremongering for the workers of the North East.
Secretary of State Andrew Bowen.
Mr Speaker, despite mighty work by Conservative members of the other place, sadly the GB Energy Bill continues to make its progress through the House of Lords. The chairman of that company, to remind you, Mr Speaker, that's the chairman based in Manchester, leading a company headquartered in Aberdeen, in committee in the summer claimed GB Energy would directly employ 1,000 people. By November, that had fallen to 300 people. So, can he tell the House what is the figure, what are those jobs, where will they be based, and can he tell us once and for all what on earth GB Energy will actually do?
Mr Speaker, I'm surprised that the Shadow Secretary of State is championing the lines of the SNP. GB Energy is headquartered in Scotland. In fact, it's headquartered in his own region that he represents in Scotland, capitalised with £125 million, bringing valuable jobs to his own constituency. I suspect he might want to go back to his constituency this weekend and explain to his constituents why he doesn't want those new jobs and new industries of the future coming to his constituency.
Kirsty Blackman.
Question 7, please, Mr Speaker.
Minister.
With permission, Mr Speaker, I'll answer questions 7 and 9 together. The Labour Government's choice to protect the pensions triple lock means that millions of women pensioners will see their yearly pensions rise by up to £470 in April and by up to £1,900 over this Parliament. This is in stark contrast with the party opposite. They'd cut the state pension of over 1 million Scots. The Conservatives are still in chaos, announcing policies on the hoof that would mean a raid on pension pots. Meanwhile, this Labour Government is taking tough decisions and actions to clean up the Tories' economic mess.
Kirsty Blackman.
Does the Minister and indeed the Secretary of State agree with Labour MSPs in Scotland that WASPy women deserve compensation? Mr Speaker, I do appreciate that campaigners are disappointed. However, the Honourable Lady, I'm afraid, has got herself in a bit of a fankle, and she's eliding two separate issues, a decision about the legality of the changes and the question of compensation. The Ombudsman's findings show evidence that the vast majority of WASPy women did know that the state pension age was changing. It therefore be difficult to justify up to £10 billion on a compensation scheme and conclude that that is a fair, proportionate or good value for money use of public funds.
Can I just say, will members please look at where the questions are coming from? It's disrespectful and it's totally not the way we should be carrying on. These are senior members who know better. He's a good example of a new member, Anne Davis.
Thank you, Mr Llefarydd. In 2021, the Secretary of State previously called for a vote of redress of 1950s women, urging UK government to get on the front foot and offer serious compensation to those affected. 1950s-born women in Scotland and Wales have seen the same broken promises from Labour, with the now First Minister of Wales pledging in 2018 that a Labour government would right this justice. So with the Secretary of State, the Welsh First Minister and Labour politicians across the whole of these isles now turning their backs on 1950s women in Scotland, Wales and elsewhere, why should these women ever again believe a word they say?
Minister.
Mr Speaker, I'm afraid there's another honourable member who's in a bit of a fankle. The question about the legality of the changes has been settled by the courts. The question of compensation, which the Honourable Lady and her allies will have to answer, is why they think £10 billion, up to £10 billion of public money should be spent. Is this proportionate? Is it fair? Is it feasible? And is it value for money? The government's view is it is not.
Chris Kane.
Thank you. Does the Minister agree with me? Does the Minister agree with me that alongside the triple lock and pensions, the most important thing for women pensioners in Scotland is to fix our NHS, and that the SNP government needs to act urgently to ensure vulnerable Scots don't face what even the SNP Health Secretary says are unacceptable waits for treatment?
Minister.
Mr Speaker, I couldn't agree more. Scotland's NHS is in crisis. 1 in 6 Scots are on a waiting list. The UK Government has provided a record investment to fix Scotland's public services. The Scottish Government, led by the SNP, should get on with it.
Lord MacDougall.
The most common problem raised by women pensioners in East Hampshire to me is, like the member for Stirling says, the enormous waiting lists. And with researchers from Oxford University, Strathclyde University and Edinburgh University predicting that by the time the SNP leave office they'll be headed towards 1 million of Scots on waiting lists, how can we make sure that the billions provided in the Labour budget don't go down the same drain as everything else that is given to the SNP?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Scots today, 1 in 6 are on a waiting list. We face a housing emergency and a very stubborn attainment gap. Nobody could look round Scotland and say it is going in the right direction. That's the choice people will have to make at 2026. Is Scotland going in the right or wrong direction? Canny Scots, I'm sure, will make choices in the interests of their families and say that it's time to replace a failing SNP government.
Stephen Gethins.
And I welcome that welcome from the Labour benches. The Minister campaigned on compensation for WASPy women as the Secretary of State for Scotland did. So will she tell me, if she won't listen to the women, if she won't listen to the Ombudsman, will she listen to Scottish Labour MSPs who called for compensation?
Minister.
Mr Speaker, a third member in a dreadful fanco. What we said at the election was that we would wait the Ombudsman's report, we would examine it and we would take a view. We have taken a view. We have taken a view that up to 10 billion of public money should not be spent providing compensation on a decision that was legal and which has been concluded the vast majority of 1950 boards women were aware.
Mr Speaker, the Secretary of State recently reacted to Labour's dip in the polls in Scotland by saying the voters didn't like honesty. I wonder if it was more to do with Labour not keeping their commitment to women pensioners, or was it more to do with saying that you'd decrease fuel bills and they went up? Was it to do with saying you tackle child poverty and then take on some of the most regressive Tory policies on the 2-child cap? And as we approach Burns Night, I wonder if the Bard was right when he said, "Dare to be honest and fear no Labour." Whereas nowadays I wonder if he'd say, "Dare to be honest and fear the voters."
Mr Speaker, polls come, polls go. The fact remains this Labour Government has provided record investment for Scottish public services. I suggest the honourable member invest in a notepad so we can keep track.
Right, we now come to Prime Minister's questions. David Reid. Question number 1, Mr. Speaker. Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The senseless, barbaric murder of 3 young girls in Southport was devastating. A measure of justice has been done, but for the victims, the injured and the affected, we must see a fundamental change in how Britain protects its citizens and its children. As part of the public inquiry, Mr. Speaker, we will not let any institution deflect from their failures. Mr. Speaker, next Monday marks Holocaust Memorial Day. Visiting Auschwitz last week only strengthened my resolve to build a national Holocaust Memorial and Learning Centre beside this Parliament. Mr. Speaker, the whole House will also welcome the release of Emily Damari and other hostages from Gaza. We must now see the ceasefire deal implemented in full, the release of the remaining hostages and a surge in aid into Gaza for citizens. Mr. Speaker, may I also welcome Cheryl Corbell, whose young daughter Olivia was murdered in awful circumstances, and her sister Antonia to the Chamber. I've met them twice, and we will change the law so that most serious offenders attend their sentencing hearings. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others in addition to my duties in the House. I shall have further such meetings later today.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Before Christmas, I received nearly 1,000 handwritten letters from pupils at St Peter's Secondary School in Exeter. Each letter strongly advocated for greater support to tackle the mental health challenges faced by young people, with many sharing deeply unsettling personal stories. I'm committed to improving local mental health services to help young people build the resilience they need to live happy and healthy lives. However, Mr. Speaker, I know these challenges are not faced and not unique to my constituency and are being faced by children across our country. So can the Prime Minister please outline what steps his government are taking to enhance mental health support for our children nationwide?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank him for raising an issue of huge concern in his constituency and in all constituencies. Far too many young people are not receiving the care that they need. So we will provide access to specialist mental health professionals in every school, recruit an additional 8,500 staff to deal with children and adult mental health services, and roll out our Young Future hubs in every community. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Marcus Campbell-Savers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend will understand the importance of farming to the economy of my constituency in Penrith and Solway and Cumbria as a whole. With recent reports of foot-and-mouth outbreaks in Germany and concerns being expressed over transmission to the United Kingdom, would the Prime Minister assure this House that all government departments are on high alert and vigilant in monitoring the situation, particularly at places of entry, including airports where meat import controls can be lax? We must avoid the disaster that this would bring to UK farming.
Prime Minister.
Thank him for his question. We will do whatever it takes, Mr. Speaker, to protect farmers from the risk posed by foot and mouth. And that's why we acted swiftly to ban the imports of cattle, pigs and sheep and their products from Germany to protect farmers. We will not hesitate, Mr. Speaker, to restrict imports from additional countries if the disease spreads. We will keep the situation under close and careful review.
Leader of the Opposition, Kevin Bernard.
Mr. Speaker, can I take this opportunity to welcome the release of hostages, including Emily Damari, from barbaric captivity? I also know that the thoughts of many will be with the victims of the Southport killings. There are important questions to answer, and I will return to those after the case is concluded. Between 2009 and 2022, the OECD found children in England rose up global league tables in maths, reading and science. Conservative government action means English schools now top the Western world at maths and reading. The Prime Minister's Schools Bill, which is being voted on in committee this week, reverses the improvements that made this happen. This bill is an act of vandalism. It is wrecking a cross-party consensus that lasted for decades. Why does the Prime Minister think that so many school leaders are criticising this bill?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, it was Labour that introduced academies in the first place to drive up standards. Academies are here to stay and will continue to drive up standards. That's what the bill is about. But also in that bill are important provisions for protecting children, including a provision to stop abusers taking children out of school, a unique identifier to ensure the whereabouts of all children are known. What did the Leader of the Opposition do? She instructed all of them to vote against those measures.
He didn't even bother voting on that bill, Mr. Speaker. And he talks about safeguarding measures. That's not what the issue is. It's about the reforms that he is changing. We have an example of where these reforms were not introduced. Wales, which has been under Labour control for 2 decades. Welsh educational outcomes have tumbled down international league tables. Poor children in England now do better than wealthier children in Wales. This bill denies children the guarantee that their failing schools will be turned into a better academy. It is an attack on excellence, it is an attack on higher standards, it is an attack on aspiration. This bill is the worst of socialism, Mr. Speaker, and isn't it deprived children in England who will pay the price?
Mr. Speaker, as I said, we introduced academies, we're committed to them, we're driving standards up. But this bill is important because it also sets up breakfast clubs for the very children that she claims to champion. It limits the expense of school uniform and it puts in place vital protections for children. She has to answer the question, why did she instruct all of them to vote against child protection measures?
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister thinks that he can distract people from what is wrong with this bill. This is not about breakfast clubs and school uniforms. Teachers and parents will be horrified at just how bad this bill is. Even his own MPs may not realise it, but the bill will cut teachers' pay. It cuts pay for 20,000 teachers. His Education Secretary says there is not a ceiling for pay. They're all shaking their heads. They clearly haven't read the bill. She hasn't read the bill either. Because Clause 45 means teachers' pay will be capped. Did the Prime Minister know that the bill, as it stands, will cut teachers' pay?
Mr. Speaker, we do need flexibility in our schools. And if she'd hopped off social media for a while, she would have seen the amendment that was put down this morning to achieve that end. But she says this bill is not about child protection. We had a young child killed who was taken out of a school by an abuser. This bill closes that gap. That is urgently needed. We have children who have not gone back to school since COVID. This bill closes that gap. She can make her points on academies. We can debate academies, but to vote against the bill is a disgrace on all of them.
This is nonsense, Mr. Speaker, and the amendment he's talking about does not address this issue. He raises academies. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Like every other parent, I believe all our children should have the best teachers. Apart from cutting their pay, listen to what the head of Year 11, Mr. Speaker, at Michaela, the head of Year 11 at Michaela, the most successful school in the country, came from the armed forces. The headmistress says that with Labour's new rules, she would never have been able to hire him. Those are the academy freedoms I'm talking about. This bill would have blocked that veteran from teaching. The bill implies that doctors are not sufficiently qualified to teach biology, that Olympic medalists can't teach PE. Why is the Prime Minister closing down routes into teaching when we should be opening up more?
She knows that's not right. No, it's not. Look at the provisions in the bill. But to say there ought to be qualified teachers in our schools should not be extraordinary or opposed. And we had far too many examples in our secondary schools under their watch of teachers missing when we needed maths teachers. They championed maths. We didn't have enough maths teachers in our secondary schools, and I want every single child to have the best possible education.
The facts speak for themselves. The standards went up under Conservative governments. What we need to know is who is benefiting. Mr. Speaker, everyone is asking who is benefiting from these changes. It's not teachers. Their pay is being capped. It's not parents. Their choices are being restricted. It's definitely not children. Their outcomes will get worse. So who is benefiting? It's the trade unions. The National Education Union sent out a tick list proving that after a decade and a half, they are finally getting their way. Why is the Education Secretary allowing trade unions to run her department and ruin children's education?
The bill benefits the children who need the nourishment of a breakfast club. The bill benefits the families that can't afford uniforms. The bill benefits the children who are currently out of school and nobody knows where they are. The bill benefits the children who could be taken out of school by abusers if this bill doesn't go through. She should change her mind and support these vital provisions.
The Prime Minister needs to get out more and speak to schools. I was at the Harris Academy just this month, and what are they saying? That this bill reverses 2 decades of progress, imposing Labour's new curriculum on every school, taxing the education of children with special needs, excluding talented outsiders. The closed shop is back. This is pure educational vandalism. And alongside these attacks, removing single-word Ofsted judgments so parents cannot see the standards slipping. It is the same old Labour. Bad outcomes for all children, excellence for none. Mr. Speaker, I know what it's like to go to a school which didn't care about standards. This is a tragedy in the making. The key changes in this bill were not in their election manifesto. Isn't that because he knew parents and teachers would reject them?
Parents and teachers know we introduced academies. Parents and teachers know we're driving by standards. We're committed to them. They're part of the future. We will continue to focus on standards. And she talks about special need. She's got a nerve. I don't know. And they know it. Remember, they have asked me questions, these Prime Minister's questions, about the appalling situation of special needs under their watch. We're going to fix that mess like we're fixing every other mess.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Parents should feel confident that when their child is sick, they can take them to their local hospital to be treated as soon as possible. But last year, when my son was having difficulty breathing, like many parents, I couldn't take him to the Alexandra Hospital in Redditch, as paediatric services were temporarily closed in 2016 and have never been reinstated. As part of this government's record investment into our NHS, would the Prime Minister agree to meet with me to explore ways to enable local integrated care boards to reinstate critical services for growing towns like Redditch?
Prime Minister. Well, I thank him for raising this important issue, and I know he's campaigned on it for a very long time. We are putting, Mr. Speaker, a record £25 billion investment into the NHS as part of our plan for change. Building an NHS fit for the future means places like Redditch will see lower waiting lists and services that reflect their needs. Whilst, Mr. Speaker, responsibility over service rests with the appropriate NHS Commissioner, I will ensure that he gets a meeting with the relevant Minister to discuss the issues.
Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Ed Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I echo the Prime Minister's opening remarks about the Southport killings and Holocaust Memorial Day? Can I particularly join him in expressing our immense relief at the release of Emily Damari and celebrate the fact she's back with her mum, Mandy, and the rest of her family. Let's hope we get all the hostages released as soon as possible and the ceasefire turns into a lasting peace. Mr. Speaker, last week I urged the Prime Minister to speed up the Social Care Commission so we can get the changes people need implemented this year. The very next day it was announced that the chair of the Social Care Commission was also going to chair another important inquiry into grooming gangs. So the Prime Minister says that the job of chairing the Social Care Commission is so enormous that it's not possible to complete it within 3 years. Yet he also says that the chair of that commission, Baroness Casey, has got enough free time over the next few months to chair another inquiry. Very good point. Can the Prime Minister explain how both these things can be true?
Mr. Speaker, Baroness Casey is well placed to conduct the audit into grooming gangs, given her hard-hitting report on exploitation in Rotherham. It does not, he raises the issue, it does not affect her work on the Independent Commission on Adult Social Care, which begins in April. But as he knows, that report, or the first part of that report, will report next year, so we can deliver recommendations as we receive them. And he knows that already we're introducing fair pay agreements, providing more money for the social care funding, and putting up the allowance. So we're already taking steps. There'll be a two-part report. We will act on the recommendations as they arrive, but this needs to be done properly.
Sir Ed Davey.
I still don't think the Prime Minister is making social care reform the priority that it needs. It's urgent. And so I'm going to keep coming back to this and holding to account. But, Mr. Speaker, turning now to the United States, can the Prime Minister guarantee that he will not sell out Britain's fantastic farmers to Donald Trump in a trade deal that undermines our high food and animal welfare standards in the way that the Conservatives sold them out in the Australia and New Zealand deals?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we will work with the US, we will work with other countries, but we will never lower our standards.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thousands of my constituents across Southampton-Itchen have had to put up with years of misery because of unsafe fire protection in their own homes, developers dragging their feet, and leaseholders having to foot the bill for mistakes they didn't make. Does the Prime Minister agree that enough is enough and it's time for developers to make all homes safe? Yes. And will he reassure leaseholders who bought their homes in good faith that this government has their back?
Prime Minister. I thank him for raising this really important issue. Too many buildings are still unsafe and the speed of delivery has been far too slow. Our action plan sets out measures to identify buildings at risk and fix them faster. And my message, Mr. Speaker, is clear. The funding is there to fix this, and there's no excuse not to deliver for residents.
Adrian Ramsey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Expanding London's airports and building a third runway at Heathrow would be incredibly irresponsible in the midst of a climate emergency, flying in the face of the Climate Change Committee's advice. The Prime Minister clearly knows this because he and 7 Cabinet colleagues voted against a third runway at Heathrow in 2018. So can the Prime Minister confirm what is his position now?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to comment on speculation. He knows that we are, as a government, we are committed to growth, we're committed to the aviation sector and to our climate obligations. But I'm not going to take lectures from those who talk about climate change but oppose vital renewable infrastructure in their own constituency.
Solar farms.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Swindon North, we have the Panatoni Park development. It is one of the largest employment developments in Europe. It's got massive potential for growth. Will the Prime Minister join me in acknowledging the site for boosting economic growth in not only my region but the country, and will he come and visit it with me? Thank you.
Prime Minister. At the heart of our plan for change is growth, Mr. Speaker, to fund our public services, create good jobs and raise living standards across the country. He's right to champion one of the largest brownfield sites in the UK, which could create over 11,000 jobs on site and add £1.2 billion to the economy. It underlines the importance of this government bringing economic stability, creating the National Wealth Fund and driving up growth.
Luke Taylor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Recently, the Prime Minister visited Epsom Hospital, where he committed to not just paper over the cracks in the NHS after years of Conservative lies. Yet on Monday, his government confirmed that our St Helier Hospital will develop these wounds and the hospital will crumble. Mr. Speaker, St Helier Hospital will not survive the delay this has introduced. People will die and NHS staff will break. So I ask the Prime Minister, will he apologise to my constituents as they wait years for a new hospital building? And will he visit the hospital with me to witness firsthand the dire situation our residents face?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, he's right to raise the concerns of his constituents, and I'm not surprised that they're frustrated or even angry at the lack of delivery under the previous government. There was no credible plan. Mr. Speaker, they shut. Let me read the Infrastructure and Projects Authority's verdict on what we inherited. This is their words. There are major issues.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Philp, I expect better from the front bench, and I'm sure you're going to show better, Prime Minister.
I think he was Liz Truss's right-hand man, so we wouldn't expect anything else. The verdict on the plan that he is talking about was this. Major issues, this is their record, they should be chuckling, major issues on the definition, the schedule, the budget, the quality and the delivery. It was a fiction, always was.
Joe Platt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Alongside Greater Manchester MPs, I recently met constituents who shared distressing accounts of malpractice by a spinal surgeon affecting many across the region. They have formed an injured staff and patient group, but despite a review, they feel justice hasn't been served and the Hospital Trust is yet to conduct a full patient recall. Will the Prime Minister arrange a meeting with the group and the relevant minister to help them get the justice that they deserve?
Well, I thank her for raising this awful case, and the stories and accounts that she puts forward are heartbreaking and deeply concerning, and I will make sure that she and the group receive a meeting with the relevant Health Minister at the earliest opportunity.
Sir Bernard.
When it comes to his budget, which raised taxes, raised borrowing and raised public spending as a strategy for economic growth, when is the Prime Minister going to accept the words of the Labour Prime Minister in the 1970s, who explained to a Labour conference that in all candour that option no longer exists, and that the only way to obtain sustained economic growth will be by cutting taxes and cutting regulation?
Prime Minister.
Well, he must have missed recent reports. The ONS has just said that we've got the highest investment for 19 years. The PwC have just said that this is the second best place to invest in the world. The IMF have just upgraded growth, now saying we're predicted to be the fastest growing major European economy. Wages are up and inflation is down. That's after just 6 months.
Rosie Writing.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Kettering General Hospital is where I was born and cared for as a premature baby. But after 14 years of the Conservatives underfunding the NHS, that same maternity ward is partially closed because of RAC. And after giving birth, mothers are transported outside through the car park to receive postnatal care. So will the Prime Minister visit Kettering General to discuss how we can support services like the maternity ward and while we await our rebuild?
Prime Minister. Well, she's been a determined champion of Kettering General Hospital, and rightly so. And there are deep anger about the delay to the works because of the failure to have a plan on the party opposite. But while we implement our affordable and deliverable plan to build a new hospital, I can reassure her, Mr. Speaker, that the RAC identified at Kettering General is being mitigated and replaced through the National RAC programme.
Mike Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Before Christmas, Lord Robertson, who's leading the Strategic Defence Review, came before the Defence Select Committee and told us that he couldn't guarantee that the strategic outcomes from the review would be fully funded. Recently, we've also heard in media reports that the review might be delayed until the autumn, so that's a delay of 6 months. Will the Prime Minister take this opportunity to state categorically to the House that the Strategic Defence Review, with its important requirements for the defence of our nation, will be fully funded and delivered on time?
Prime Minister.
Of course, we're committed to that because this is a serious review into our defence. It needs to make sure that we understand the challenges we face and have the capability to deal with those challenges in the modern era. So that's the exercise that's going through. We've committed to the path to 2.5%. As he knows, the last time 2.5% was spent on defence was under the last Labour government. And that is the difference between the approach on this side of the House and the approach on that side of the House.
Harpley Temple.
Huddersfield Royal Infirmary has recently reduced its elective waiting list from a high of 4,000 to just 20. Will the Prime Minister join me in paying tribute to NHS staff at my local hospital? Will he ensure that the NHS learns from the HRI's innovative approaches, such as the use of AI for scans and its partnership with Huddersfield University's National Health Innovation Campus? And whilst the Prime Minister does his hospital tour, can I also invite him to Huddersfield to see the transformative work being done?
Prime Minister. Look, can I thank her because the achievements of the hard-working staff at Huddersfield Royal Infirmary prove that you can bring down waiting times through our plan for change. And it is important we're applying that best practice and innovation across the NHS. We must do more. We inherited record waiting lists and we are now bringing them down.
Andrew Snowden.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. In what is supposed to be a honeymoon period for a new government, the Prime Minister has sacked his Chief of Staff, forced his City Minister and Transport Secretary to resign, whilst Number 10 has been briefing against the Pensions Secretary, Home Secretary and Education Secretary. Is it not time that the Prime Minister accepts that the root causes at the heart of this government are with him, not them?
We just won a landslide victory. We've got a massive majority. We're getting on with the job. Mr. Speaker, I don't think we saw. Look at the sheer number of ministers that they got through on a yearly basis, causing instability in every conceivable department.
Paul Davies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In 2016, I was diagnosed with colon cancer and had excellent treatment at Huddersfield Royal Infirmary. I was one of the lucky ones, as the Tory governments after 2015 failed in the fight against cancer, with over 380,000 patients in England not treated on time. What assurance can the Prime Minister offer Colne Valley residents that the reforms and extra investment he's announced will address this issue?
Prime Minister.
Well, can I start by wishing him a speedy recovery from his recent treatment and thank the doctors and nurses who treated him. Under the previous government, there was no progress made in diagnosing cancer at stage 1 and 2 between 2013 and 2021. That is an appalling inheritance. We are spending £1.5 billion on new surgical hubs and diagnostic scanners to ensure cancer patients get the care that they need. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, eating disorders are the mental health disorder with the highest mortality rate. We have 1.2 million sufferers at least. Some are being told that they are now too ill to be treated, yet eating disorders are entirely treatable. Today, the Eating Disorder APPG is publishing its report of how to make eating disorder services fit for purpose. Can I ask the Prime Minister to pay very close attention to that report?
Prime Minister.
Can I start by recognising her dedicated work and campaigning on this issue for many years. NHS England is expanding eating disorder treatment services, including crisis care and intensive home treatment. And as she knows, the Online Safety Act will prevent children from encountering harmful product content that promotes eating disorders to services. And we will look very carefully, obviously, at the report that is being published and consider its recommendations.
Sarah Owen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the past few days, Luton has suffered 2 stabbings, as well as 1 woman murdered, another seriously injured, and a manhunt is currently underway for the suspect. This January alone, there has been at least 12 recorded violent offences in Luton. After decades of being funded as a rural police force, Bedfordshire has had to make do with special grants to tackle serious and violent crime. Does the Prime Minister agree that proper police funding is essential for keeping people in Luton North safe? And will he ensure Bedfordshire Police receive the grants we need to fight crime on our streets?
Well, I thank you for raising this case. And she and I have met far too many families devastated by this senseless violence. We are taking urgent action to ban zombie-style knives and regulating the online sale of knives. It is unacceptable that these murder weapons can be bought with 2 clicks. Technology is there to stop it, and we're going to take action. And on the resources, we're putting an additional 13,000 police into neighbourhood roles and allocating £85 million to Bedfordshire Police in funding to keep her constituents safe.
Iqbal Mohammed.
Mr. Speaker, may I associate with the remarks from the Prime Minister regarding the ceasefire and the release of hostages, and let's all pray that the remaining hostages on both sides are released as soon as possible. Since the ceasefire in Gaza came into effect, Israeli forces have placed the whole of the West Bank under strict military inspection as part of the Iron Wall operation. The IDF has launched a large-scale offensive operation in the city of Jenin, with numerous drone strikes on the infrastructure and a military raid by IDF troops and special forces in the occupied West Bank. At least 9 people have been killed by Israeli forces and 40 people injured, including several healthcare workers. What steps is the government taking to urgently protect Palestinians, including healthcare workers, and to prevent atrocities in the West Bank? And will he outline the UK's response to the ICJ advisory opinion on Israel's unlawful occupation?
Minister.
I'm deeply concerned by what's happening in the West Bank. And we've raised it a number of times in the various exchanges that we've had, but I am deeply concerned about it, and we're doing everything we can to alleviate the situation.
Sarah Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Tamworth Castle, boasting 1,000 years of history, was recently added to the Heritage at Risk Register following my campaign about its future. Despite needing repairs, it provides a unique and valuable learning environment, welcoming both the public and schools to learn about Tamworth's rich history. Will the Prime Minister come and visit Tamworth Castle to see how an 11th century castle is providing 21st century learning opportunities whilst promoting local heritage?
Prime Minister.
Can I thank you for a kind invitation? I particularly enjoyed Tamworth's recent FA Cup heroics against Tottenham, albeit they didn't quite win. Mr. Speaker, we are committed to protecting our most vulnerable heritage, and I know Historic England is working closely with Tamworth Borough Council to preserve this local treasure for future generations. It's particularly important to continue school visit programmes supporting our mission to get every child the best opportunities in life.
Alison Bennett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Across England, there are 95,000 students who attend non-academised sixth form colleges. Of those colleges, 32 are currently on strike because the government didn't settle the funding for them back in last summer. I wonder, could the Prime Minister tell me whether he intended to create a two-tier education system for sixth form students who are the victims of the COVID crisis?
Prime Minister.
We have put more money into colleges, and it's really for them to deal with these disputes, as she knows.
Lee Ingham.
Mr. Speaker, from Stafford to Eccleshall to Loggerheads, my constituents are sick and tired of having their properties and businesses devastated by flooding. The last Conservative government did not invest enough in flood prevention measures to stop this from happening. Can the Prime Minister assure me and my constituents that he will prioritise flood prevention investment before the homes and businesses on Sandon Road in Stafford disappear completely into Sandyford Brook?
Prime Minister.
Well, my sympathies go to her constituents. Far too many are experiencing terrible flooding. I visited there last year and met them, and they talked me through the misery of their experience. We inherited flood defences in their worst condition on record. We are now investing £2.4 million in flood defences to better protect communities, and committed £60 million to support farmers impacted by the extreme weather.
Rebecca Smith.
Thank you. 2-year mortgages have hit 5%. Borrowing is billions above forecast. Retail sales have slumped. Does the Prime Minister still believe the Chancellor is doing a good job?
I thought she was just reading out their last record.
Final question, Mount Termin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Excuse me. Before the last election, the Conservatives baselessly promised a fully funded scheme to deliver a new Watford hospital, something they have failed to achieve in 14 years. Does the Prime Minister share my frustration and that of my constituents that they unforgivably failed to budget for its construction, and Watford will only get its new hospital built and paid for thanks to the properly planned approach of this Labour government?
I'm not surprised his constituents are frustrated. There was never a plan. The funding only ever existed in Boris Johnson's imagination. It was pure fiction, and they know it. We have an affordable and delivery plan to build these new hospitals, and that includes Watford General, and we'll be getting on with it.
That completes Prime Minister's questions. We now come to the urgent question. Andrew Griffiths.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To ask the Secretary of State for Business and Trade if he will make a statement on the position of the Chairman of the Competition and Markets Authority.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following the resignation of the Chair of the Competition and Markets Authority, Marcus Bockerink, the Secretary of State has appointed Doug Gurr as the interim Chair for a period of up to 18 months, while a new permanent Chair is appointed. The Secretary of State has expressed his gratitude for Marcus's leadership of the board of the CMA since his appointment in September 2022 and the work of the CMA in that time, particularly in response to cost of living pressures. As the Prime Minister set out in his speech at the International Investment Summit, this government will make sure that every regulator in the UK focuses on growth. With his background and experience as an entrepreneur and business leader, along with a clear understanding of the importance of new and developing technologies such as AI, Doug Gurr will bring the necessary strategic leadership to the CMA to enable it to promote growth to the benefit of businesses and consumers. As set out in the Industrial Strategy Green Paper, the Government will shortly be consulting on a new growth-focused strategic steer to the CMA. Whilst respecting the independence of the CMA and the decision-making of its panel members, the steer will be clear about the Government's expectations of the CMA in supporting growth across the economy.
Secretary of State Andrew.
Mr. Speaker, thank you for granting this important urgent question. What a desperate state we are in when the Business Secretary has to phone up the regulators to beg them for ideas to fix the lack of growth his own government policies have created. And I hope that when the regulators attended that roundtable last week, including the chairman of the CMA, they had the courage to put at the top of their list scrapping his 150-page, job-destroying, trade union-inspired employment bill, or to point out the jobs tax in the Chancellor's budget, or their socialist attack on inheritance, non-doms, and the family business death tax that's causing one wealth creator to leave this country every 45 minutes. Or even to point out that one of the best opportunities this country has for growth would be to get on a plane to our closest trading partner, the United States, and secure a trade deal, rather than lob juvenile insults at President Trump or fail to invite Elon Musk to the government's UK Investment Summit. Mr. Speaker, it's certainly the case that whilst regulators have a role, we agree they generally depress growth, drive risk aversion, bureaucracy and slow decision-making. Asking regulators to boost growth is a bit like asking the Village Speedwatch to organise the next British Grand Prix. I am a fan of Speedwatch. The Conservative Party is under new management, and we're unafraid to back wealth creators and risk takers. We're unashamed to say we need fewer civil servants and arm's-length regulators so that our businesses carry less deadweight in the global race to be competitive. But dismissing the non-executive, part-time chairman of the CMA seems a curious place to start. He's not responsible for day-to-day decision-making at the CMA. That's the job of the chief executive. Did they aim and miss? Could the minister confirm if there are plans to change the government's view on the CMA's remit, to play the ball, not the man? And what evaluation of all regulators has there been as part of this process, and when will the government publish that? Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I think there were a couple of questions in there about the role of the CMA chair. Of course, he didn't get sacked. He resigned, and there will be a new strategic steer for the CMA coming out in due course. Now, amongst the tirade of criticisms of this government, which I think is a little bit rich from the man who was in the Treasury when the last government crashed the economy, I would point out to him that only this week PwC announced we were the second most attractive country in the world to invest, and last week the IMF upgraded our growth predictions for this year. And we're now going to be the highest growing economy, major economy in Europe this year. And I think that shows us the determination that we've got to get growth going, something that his government failed completely on.
Gregor Pointer.
Mr. Speaker, getting the right regulatory environment is vital to drive innovation in our economy, but also protect our consumers and markets too. Does the Minister agree with me that this renewed focus on the regulatory environment and getting that right to drive our economy will make sure that this government delivers our number one mission of growth?
Minister.
Thank my honourable friend for his question. He's absolutely right. Growth is the number one mission for this government, and it's about getting that balance right between protecting consumers and driving up growth for the economy. And then we all benefit, and that's something we're very clear on this side the last government failed to deliver on.
Clive Jones, Liberal Democrat spokesperson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government is right that bold and ambitious steps are needed to get our economy growing again, especially after the damage caused by the previous Conservative government. But we must also recognise that fair competition is the lifeblood of our market economy, which helps drive innovation and ensures economic benefits reach consumers. Does the Secretary of State agree that ensuring proper competition in the economy is vital to achieving sustained growth? I also note that the new interim chair has prior experience running Amazon's UK business. Will the Secretary of State guarantee that the Digital Markets Unit within the CMA will be backed to hold powerful tech giants accountable for the benefit of customers in Wokingham and across the UK?
Minister.
I thank the Liberal Democrat spokesperson for his questions. We're absolutely clear that we do need to protect consumers, but we also need to drive growth. And actually, the new interim chair's experience is really important to help us understand how tech companies are going to be moving forward. His chairmanship of the Turing Institute, I think, is a valuable piece of experience that we'll bring to the table in terms of delivering on that.
Jill Morrow.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I should declare an interest, having worked for a competition regulator for a number of years before entering Parliament. And can I suggest to the Minister that he does not take his competition policy lessons from the party opposite, who oversaw the remonopolisation of the broadband network, the consolidation of power within tech networks to an unprecedented scale, and the rise of crony capitalism on a scale not seen before. But can I ask the Minister that some of the rumours around this appointment have suggested that this is a signal of a flight away from competition regulation? Can I urge him to quash those rumours and to confirm that this government believes that competition drives investment, innovation and growth, and that this country is open for investment and new market entry by as many companies as possible?
Minister.
Can I thank my honourable friend for a question? We absolutely do agree that competition is vital for driving investment and growth, and the operational independence of the CMA will remain in place as it has always done.
John Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government seems fascinated by the price of Oasis tickets. Meanwhile, debt and the cost of debt is soaring. Should the government not, definitely, not maybe, come up with some ideas of their own for growth, rather than trying to copy the homework of regulators?
Minister.
Well, of course, we have our own ideas for growth. We've got important planning reforms coming forward. The industrial strategy drives forward on the strengths of the UK economy. And in terms of his Oasis plan, I think he needs to work a little bit harder on that one, I'm afraid.
Sean Hodgson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over the last 15 years of my dealings with the CMA and my campaign to end the abuse of the secondary ticketing market, I've long felt that the CMA is desperately in need of much stronger and clearer ministerial oversight. So can the Minister today confirm which Minister that will be going forward who will have oversight of the CMA, and that that role will be an active role, not just a one in name only?
Minister. I thank my honourable friend for a question, and her work on secondary ticketing, which obviously is out for consultation at the moment. I am the Minister responsible for the CMA. There will be a new strategic steer for them issued later in the year, and of course their independence from government will remain in place.
Bob Black.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The clear issue here is why did the previous chair resign, and indeed what remit has the Minister given to the interim chair to change that policy and direction of the CMA. So can he outline that to the House? He says he's going to do it later this year, but he's manoeuvred a position where the previous chair has resigned. So we need to know the answer of what the CMA are going to be doing now to regulate the market.
Minister.
Well, the CMA's operational independence is going to remain intact. We've obviously very clearly set out there will be a new strategic steer, which will be about boosting growth, and we've decided after conversations that actually new leadership is needed to actually deliver on that.
John Grady.
I'm obliged, Mr. Speaker, and I should declare that I have, before entering this House, advised as a competition law on various CMA matters, including investigations and panels. May I say, Mr. Speaker, some of the criticisms from the bench opposite seem to be half the world away to Channel Oasis from the topic in question and economic reality. However, would the Minister confirm that yesterday's announcement does not change the independence of the individual CMA panels which deal with matters before the CMA?
Minister.
No, I thank my honourable friend for his question and absolutely can confirm the operational independence of the CMA remains intact.
Bobby Dean.
Mr Speaker, we live in an age where the power invested in large corporations is bigger than ever, and we have got tech giants exerting monopolistic power over the market. So I'm getting a bit exasperated with the government's attitude, it seems Thatcherite-like, towards deregulation. So does the government understand the risks involved in going for short-term boosts to growth, to the long-term stability of the economic market?
I thank him for his question. I wouldn't accept that characterisation at all. I'm sure the members in the official opposition would not either. Of course, we've only just announced this morning that we'll be taking action against Amazon in terms of sales of now, so I don't think the characterisation of us being in the pocket of big tech is at all accurate.
Luke Charles.
Speaker, the CMA took far too long to reach a decision on the Vodafone and 3 merger, and this slowed down the rollout of 5G across all of our constituencies and was a drag on growth. So can my honourable friend confirm how regulators can be pushed to ensure that their decisions lead to growth?
I thank my honourable friend for his question. It is absolutely right that we need to give confidence to the business community that when they're making investments, that decisions will be made quickly, there will be certainty, and that they can move forward with their decisions to benefit the whole economy off the back of that.
Sir Desmond Swayne.
The impact on growth of the record number of millionaires who've left the UK since the budget?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I'm not sure the CMA's role is to monitor the number of millionaires leaving the country.
Speaker, in 2023, the last Conservative Chancellor, the Right Honourable Member for Godalming and Ash, said that the CMA must, quote, understand their wider responsibilities, end quote, after the CMA blocked a particular merger. And then he also went on to say, quote, I do think it's important all our regulators understand their wider responsibilities for economic growth. He was...
Sorry. Yes, he was right, and that's the message the Prime Minister set out to the regulators at the Investment Summit. That's why they've been invited in to give their ideas on growth. We don't think it's a problem asking regulators how they're going to stimulate growth. It is the #1 mission of this government, and everyone should be signed up to delivering on that.
Glynis Meddy.
The government says that the CMA chair had failed to convince them he was sufficiently focused on growth, but at the same time, reports suggest that the government planned to freeze all rail spending except for 3 projects in England. A lack of transport funding is stifling growth in Welsh economy. To prove his commitment to growth, will he outline the transport funding his government has committed to Wales?
I thank the honourable lady for her question. Unfortunately, transport funding is, and particularly in Wales, as well outside the remit of the CMA.
John Slinger.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Does my honourable friend agree with me that the UK's economic regulators have a responsibility to ensure supersonic growth in our economy with a pro-business approach, and this is part of what I would term a responsibility agenda? We all have a responsibility, and they do too, to ensure the best for our economy.
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for his question. He's absolutely right. We all need to be signed up to this agenda. It is absolutely critical for delivering on our aims, getting a better growing economy, getting more money into people's pockets, delivering on the promises that we've made, and changing the tune from the last 14 years of decline.
Sir Julian Smith.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Changing personnel is one thing, but when you speak to business, resolving disputes and the way that the CMA resolve dispute is key. Could I urge the Minister to look at how disputes are resolved and whether litigation and an antagonistic approach to business is the best way for the CMA to proceed?
Minister.
I thank the honourable member for his question. I think that is a very fair comment. We need to give businesses certainty and clarity that things will be resolved quickly and that they will have confidence moving forward that investment decisions will be made.
Olivia Benn.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can the Minister confirm how the Department plans to appoint the permanent chair?
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for a question. The appointment of the permanent chair will take place in the normal manner as all of appointments do.
David Chadwick.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. An active regulator is essential for securing fair prices for consumers, and residents in areas like mine are often at the forefront of rises in petrol prices. And residents in Pontardawe are often left wondering why they often have to pay 8 pence more per litre than in nearby towns. Will the government commit to launching the Pump Watch petrol price comparison platform as recommended by the Competition and Markets Authority.
Minister.
I thank the Honourable Member for that question. I think that's a very important point. It is something that consumers visibly see every time they leave their homes and their motor vehicles, that there is a disparity there that sometimes needs some explanation. It certainly needs transparency, so I will take that up for him and come back to him on that.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Constituents of mine, particularly those living in Crookford in East Renfrewshire, have terrible mobile phone signal. Can I also ask about the merger between Three and Vodafone and how the CMA can progress that so that we have the investment needed into transmitters to improve the mobile phone signal in areas like Crookford but also around the country?
I thank my honourable friend for his question. Certainly that's something that the CMA have been dealing with, and I'm sure that we can provide him with an update on where that is shortly.
Mr Speaker, will the Minister ask the Competition and Markets Authority to investigate why we have the highest energy prices in the world, particularly electricity?
Certainly pass that request on. I think that might be something that Ofgem would also have an interest in.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the Minister for his responses so far. Would he agree with me that actually the first role of the Competition and Markets Authority is to ensure that regulation is followed, that they break up monopolies, and actually at a time whenever our small businesses are suffering and the national insurance increase has not helped in that regard, would he agree with me that that is actually their first duty? If they take decisions that just so happen to have a byproduct of stimulating economic growth, that's as well as may be. But the narrative that actually taking away regulation is just going to promote growth in itself is wrong.
It might be worth putting for an adjournment debate. Minister.
Well, I thank the honourable member for her question. It is important that consumers and small businesses operate on a level playing field. It is also correct that something that we are very keen to see is more growth delivered, and we think that will benefit everyone in the economy. But I absolutely take the point that the balance has to be struck there.
Mr Grady, I think you've asked a question. Yeah, I think the whips need to be advising a bit more. Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the Minister very much for his answers? The role of the CMA Chair is essential in the current economic climate. As we watch how our allies in the US of A approach their trading and deals, we need a message of strength in relaying that fact that we are ready and open for international business. So does the Minister believe that this interim measure sends that message? And how quickly can we get the right person in place to promote our business standing? Thank you so much.
Well, I thank the honourable member for his question. We are really serious about growth. This is about sending a message that we want to make sure that Britain is open for investment, that we work with partners across the world to encourage that kind of investment, get that growth that we want to see to benefit the entire economy. And this is just one part of that plan.
Okay. That completes the urgent question. I'll let the front bench change over.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. With permission, I wish to make a statement on the UK's response to recent Russian maritime activity. I'm glad the House has been waiting for this morning. Mr Speaker, a foreign vessel, Yenta, is currently in the North Sea, having passed through British waters. Let me be clear. This is a Russian spy ship used for gathering intelligence and mapping the UK's critical underwater infrastructure. Yantar entered the UK exclusive economic zone about 45 miles off the British coast on Monday. For the last 2 days, the Royal Navy has deployed HMS Somerset and HMS Tyne to monitor the vessel every minute through our waters. And I changed the Royal Navy's rules of engagement so that our warships can get closer and better track the Yantar. So far, the ship has complied with international rules of navigation. But, Mr. Speaker, this is the second time that Yantar has entered our waters in recent months. In November, the ship was also closely watched and detected loitering over UK critical undersea infrastructure. To deter any potential threat, I took measured steps then as part of a clear direct response to the Russian vessel. RAF maritime patrol aircraft, alongside HMS Katistok, HMS Tyne, and RFA Proteus, were deployed to shadow Yantar's every movement. Today, I also wanted to confirm to the House that I authorised a Royal Navy submarine, strictly as a deterrent measure, to surface close to Yantar to make clear that we had been covertly monitoring its every move. The ship then left UK waters without further loitering and sailed down to the Mediterranean. As colleagues will understand, I won't comment further on reasons for operational security, but I want to thank all the personnel involved for their dedication and their professionalism. And I also want President Putin to hear this message. We see you, we know what you're doing, and we will not shy away from robust action to protect this country. And with our NATO allies, we're strengthening our response to ensure that Russian ships and aircraft cannot operate in secrecy near the UK or near NATO territory. Mr. Speaker, this is another example of growing Russian aggression, targeting our allies abroad and us at home. The heads of MI6 and the CIA recently stated together in a joint statement Russia is waging, they said, a reckless campaign of sabotage across Europe. We're seeing periodic incursions of Russian military aircraft into airspace for which we are responsible. And on Christmas Day, the S-Link 2 undersea cable between Finland and Estonia was damaged. Many analysts believe this was caused by a vessel in Russia's shadow fleet. Mr. Speaker, Russia is dangerous but fundamentally weak. In Ukraine, it has suffered devastatingly high rates of casualties over 3 years in a war that it thought it would win in a week. And compounding the humiliation, Putin has been forced to turn to North Korea to reinforce its frontline fighters. And while the strategic defeat in Syria, of course, has exposed its diminishing power on the global stage, and at home, the Russian economy faces crippling strains. Nevertheless, Mr. Speaker, Russia remains the most pressing and immediate threat to Britain. And I want to assure the House and the British people that any threat will be met with strength and resolve. First, we're delivering on the foundation of security in our plan for change by making Britain secure at home. Yantar has now passed through the Dover Strait and is in Dutch waters. In September, RAF Typhoon scrambled to intercept 2 Russian Bear F aircraft operating near the UK. And the Royal Fleet Auxiliary is also playing an indispensable role in safeguarding offshore infrastructure with its multi-role ocean surveillance ship, RFA Proteus. Second, we are making Britain strong abroad, working with NATO and Joint Expeditionary Force allies. The UK activated Nordic Warden with Jeff partners after the S-Link 2 cable damage. The operation is tracking potential threats to undersea infrastructure, monitoring the movements of the Russian shadow fleet, and sending out real-time warnings of suspicious activity to Jeff allies and to NATO. And today I can confirm that the RAF will provide P-8 Poseidon and Rivet Joint Surveillance aircraft to join the new Baltic Sentry NATO deployment to protect critical infrastructure in the Baltic Sea. And third, Mr. Speaker, with allies we're piling on pressure on Putin. This year the UK will provide more financial aid in military support to Ukraine than at any time since the full-scale invasion began. 4.5 billion, delivering military support to enhance training and strengthen industrial collaboration. The UK is also leading ways to put pressure on the Russian economy, including sanctioning over 100 ships in the Russian shadow fleet, more than any other nation. Working with other countries to stop Russian military acquiring the goods and the equipment and the technologies they require to continue their fight and war against Ukraine. And with allies exposing the activities of the Russian intelligence services, expelling Russian intelligence officers, and sanctioning individuals responsible for hostile activity against the UK. Mr. Speaker, Russian aggression will not be tolerated at home or in Ukraine. It's why one of the first acts of this government was for the Prime Minister to launch the Strategic Defence Review. It's why the government has increased defence spending next year by almost £3 billion. And why we'll set a path to increase defence spending to 2.5% of GDP in the spring. Mr. Speaker, this new era of threat demands a new era for defence. Change is essential, not optional, and the government is determined to meet the challenge, determined to deliver for defence. We will protect the homeland and our critical national infrastructure, and we will make Britain secure at home and strong abroad.
Secretary of State James Cobb.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for early sight of his statement. Particularly grateful to the Secretary of State for the greater level of transparency he has chosen to share with the House about the grey zone threat from Russia. We welcome that transparency because it is critical for our war readiness as a nation that, as far as we are able, and without compromising our national security and operational security, we tell the British public the truth about the serious nature of the Russian threat and what that will inevitably mean for public expenditure on defence. Now, I specifically welcome the change to the Royal Navy's rules of engagement. This sends a powerful signal to Putin that we will not be intimidated, and that if his aim is to keep pushing the boundaries of malign activity in our waters and those proximate to us, we will respond. And I can confirm that the government will have the full backing of His Majesty's opposition in doing so. We stand shoulder to shoulder with the government on Ukraine. We stand shoulder to shoulder with them on deterring the wider Russian threat that he has outlined today. Now, I appreciate it is unusual to go into such operational detail, including about the operational deployment of submarines. Equally, we appreciate that this is about sending the strongest possible signal to our adversaries about our clear intent to protect and defend our homeland. So, if I may, I have a number of specific questions about the statement and its particular contents. A key issue here is the safety and protection of critical undersea infrastructure. Beyond the operations the Secretary of State mentioned in his speech, such as Nordic Warden, will he confirm whether he is looking to widen the number of international partners proactively involved in addressing this threat to the North Sea and the Baltic, and what discussions is he having to drive an internationally coordinated response, including through NATO? Given our prominent role within NATO, we have a clear opportunity to lead the way in developing cutting-edge underwater technologies that address these threats directly. Can the Secretary of State confirm that he is prioritising development of underwater capabilities, such as uncrewed systems, through Pillar 2 of AUKUS, but also with European allies, and in particular that R&D investment into capabilities to protect critical infrastructure will be an urgent priority? Moreover, will he commit to do everything possible to hinder the abilities of GRU operatives, including all possible action in concert with allies, to restrict their ability to enter the United Kingdom? Madam Deputy Speaker, I am very grateful to the personnel of our Navy, the RFA and our Air Force involved in addressing these threats, and I want to sincerely thank them as well as the crews of allied vessels who assisted in tracking this ship through their waters. One particularly important point the Secretary of State said was that Russia is dangerous but fundamentally weak. Does he nevertheless agree that Russia's willingness to tolerate such enormous losses on the battlefield against Ukraine underlines that in conventional military terms, it remains a formidable foe before one even considers its unconventional capabilities. In my view, Russia remains a critical threat to the United Kingdom. And for that reason, I very much welcome the Secretary of State's clear decision to be more open with the country about the threat we face. So can I urge him to ensure that from the heart of government, we have a serious grip on communicating and planning for the fact we do face the most serious nation-on-nation military threat to our homeland for generations. In turn, this means that the SDR needs to be fundamentally threat-driven, prioritising homeland defence and putting the necessary resource in place. So to conclude, Madam Deputy Speaker, in a situation where we have seen the RFA, the Royal Navy, submarines, helicopters, P-8 aircraft and other assets involved in tracking Russian activity, does this not show the full extent of the work needed to defend our island and deter our adversaries, and ultimately why we need to increase defence spending as soon as possible? Finally, he said again in his statement, as he did at orals, and I welcome it, that the SDR will report in the spring. Can I urge him to ensure that this is in March at the very earliest opportunity, and that we will achieve at least 2.5% spending on defence this Parliament?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I welcome the Shadow Defence Secretary's welcome for this statement and for the Government's greater transparency. He, like I, has confirmed that he sees Russia as, in his words, the most critical threat to the UK. He's been a Defence Minister. He understands, as he acknowledges, the importance of sending the strongest possible signals to our adversaries, and that is the underlying reason for the decision I've taken to make this statement today. He asks about and argues that this is an opportunity for the UK to demonstrate leadership within NATO in response. I think we have already done that, not by asserting that argument, by the actions in launching and leading through the GEF 10 nations, the Nordic Warden response to the attack on the S-Link 2, and by now confirming that we will play a leading role in the new NATO deployment into the Baltic, which is linked to the work that we're doing through Nordic Warden. He asks about the priority for our undersea cables for our homeland infrastructure. These cables aren't simply a technical network. These are the infrastructure, the things that we depend on for our daily lives, the operation of the internet, the supply of energy, the communications with other parts of the world. He will therefore have seen and noted in the terms of reference of the Strategic Defence Review launched by the Prime Minister within 2 weeks of this government being elected in July, that defending and reinforcing the homeland defence of Britain is foremost in those terms of reference. And we will, as I've said, report on the Strategic Defence Review in the spring.
There are members bobbing in the chamber that weren't here at the start of the debate. We've made a note of all of those and the time they arrived, and they will not be called. If you don't know if that means you, speak to your whip. I call the Defence Select Committee Chair, Tamarjit Singh Desi.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Defence, for advance sight of his statement. And in particular, it is very apt that he should be making this statement because during our Defence Committee visit to RAF Lossiemouth in Scotland last week, we were discussing this very issue. Clearly also there is a greater need for greater availability and capacity for Royal Navy and other maritime capability to meet the rising Russian activity in waters surrounding the UK. For example, the threats to critical undersea infrastructure. My two questions to the Secretary of State. Firstly, what lessons has the government learnt from the Finnish investigation into Eagle S, accused of damaging the undersea infrastructure between Finland and Estonia? And secondly, what measures are available to the government to stop vessels from traversing UK waters, to build upon the recent insurance checks that were put in place in October, is sanctioning vessels our only option?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank the Select Committee Chair, if I may, and the members of his committee for not just the work they're doing, but the work that they are willing to do outside this House. And I thank them for the visit that they paid to Lossiemouth to see for themselves some of the essential work that our forces personnel and civilians are playing in defending this country. He asks about the Finnish investigation into the S-Link 2 cable damage. That is for the Finns to complete and to confirm the findings of their investigation, and it'll be at that point that I think we can draw and discuss any lessons that there may be for the UK. Finally, we defend more fiercely than perhaps any other nation in the world the freedom of navigation in our seas, and the ships of all states may navigate through our territorial waters. They are subject to the right of innocent passage, and so some of the steps that he might wish upon the government and urge us to take are simply not available to us under the United Nations law of the open seas. And so it's for that reason that we take such steps and we take the actions that I've reported to the House in order to make sure that we monitor, we watch, we track, and that those who may enter our waters with malign intent or try to undertake any malign activity know that we see them and know that they will face the strongest possible response.
It's also important for the front bench to arrive on time to hear the opening statement, and I believe the Liberal Democrat spokesperson was 4 minutes late. And it's important to note that they may not be called in the future. But on this occasion, I do invite the Liberal Democrat spokesperson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and apologies for my lateness. Thank you, Minister, for the advance sight of the statement. It goes without saying that we stand shoulder to shoulder in our support with this government against the Russian threat, and we thank all those service personnel involved in dealing with this threat. The Lib Democrats believe our defence policy and conventional forces should be focused on defending British territory and playing a leading role in our immediate European neighbourhood. As such, we welcome the Government's announcement that the Royal Air Force will provide P8, Poseidon and Rivet Joint Maritime Patrol and Surveillance aircraft to join Baltic Sentry under NATO command. Action to defend the realm is particularly pressing in light of recent escalations of hybrid threats from Russia. The suspected sabotage of undersea cables, including the damage to S-Link 2 on Christmas Day, underscores the urgency of this moment. Such cables are the lifeblood of international connectivity and commerce, and any attack on them is an attack on the collective stability of Europe. The events involving the tanker Eagle S and its links to sanctioned entities supporting Putin's war machine are deeply alarming. This is not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of aggression that demands robust and coordinated action. This government must rebuild trust with our European neighbours. The UK's national interests and security have always been inextricably tied to Europe's. From World War II through to the Cold War to the current war in Ukraine, our shared defence has been vital. To that end, we urge the government to work hand in glove with NATO countries to support Ukraine during the war and in rebuilding afterwards, including finding lawful ways to use the $300 billion of frozen Russian state assets as reparations. Sign a comprehensive security treaty with the European Union to strengthen collaborative defence, and collaborate on developing cutting-edge defence technologies and ensure interoperability with NATO allies to respond effectively in times of crisis. We also face serious national vulnerabilities. The UK lacks land-based anti-ballistic missile systems to protect critical national infrastructure, and questions remain about the ability to secure the Greenland UK gap. We welcome the government's commitment to spending 2.5% of GDP on defence, but when will the government outline a clear timeline for achieving this? This is not the time for complacency. The threats are clear and the response must be decisive.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I have some sympathy with the Honourable Lady. Perhaps she, like I, thought there may be more interest in this House in the operation of the Competition and Markets Authority than the length of the urgent question proved to be. And it may just be that I can run a little faster than her as a result. But Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank the Honourable Lady for her support for the UK contribution to the the Baltic Sentry NATO operation. We play a leading role in NATO. We will play a leading role in this operation in the Baltic. It's reinforcing our allies, and by reinforcing our allies, we reinforce our own defences, and we strengthen collectively the deterrence we can as NATO nations offer to any future aggression and aggressive intent from President Putin. She urges us to work hand in glove with allies over the support for Ukraine, which is indeed what we are committed to do. It's why the Prime Minister was in Kyiv last week when he confirmed the record level of funding for this year to support military aid to Ukraine, and when he signed a 100-year partnership with Ukraine. Finally, he made the commitment that I think the Honourable Lady is looking for, which he said, whatever happens next, our job is to put Ukraine in the strongest possible position, both on the battlefield and at any negotiating table. And that's what I, as Defence Secretary, are determined to do for this country.
Blair McDougall.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Putin and his autocratic friends mistake our freedom and openness for weakness, and so can I enthusiastically welcome the strength of the response to the Russian activity. He'll be aware of the reports in Newsweek in recent days about patents that have been filed in China for specific cable cutting technology for presumed military use by the Chinese. So I wonder if he can reassure the House, and as well as being active in deterring Putin, that he's also and that the government are also taking a similarly robust stance to any attempts to cut the cables from China.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I can reassure the Honourable Gentleman that I am aware of what he cites. I am aware of the pace of development of many aspects of Chinese technology and equipment. Much of it may be for civilian use, but I can assure him also that we, with allies, are keeping a very close eye on what they're developing.
Sir Gavin Williamson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I'd like to thank the Secretary of State for the statement, the action he's taken, and also all the work our servicemen have been doing in terms of combating this threat. Obviously, the Yantar is a very well-known threat and has been for quite a long time, but Russia has been very capable of using private and commercial vessels in order to be able to map cables and look at actually undermining our security. The reality is we need more resources within our Royal Navy and our other services. What assurance can the Secretary of State give the House that actually the bid is being put together for Treasury to make sure that they properly resource him and our servicemen to do the job we're also dependent on?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, our UK servicemen and women will appreciate his thanks in the House today. I can give him that assurance, and most important, I can give him the commitment that we made to the British people at the election, that we're a government that will increase defence spending, will increase it to 2.5% of GDP, and that, of course, is a level that Britain has not spent on defence since 2010.
Michelle Scroggin.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank my right honourable friend for his statement. Over recent years, we've seen a large increase in Russian activity of this type, and it's clear that the need for subsurface protection is both critical and increasing. The UK subfleet is built at BAE Systems in my constituency, and we play a vital role in countering this threat. Would my right honourable friend comment on the support that this government is providing and will continue to provide to ensure that the submarine fleet continues to play this central role in the defence of our nation?
I can indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker, and she, like I, intensely proud of everything that is done, designed and developed at the Barrow shipyard. It is central to our UK security and has been for decades, and she'll be proud, like I, that the Royal Navy submarine that surfaced close to the Yantar in November, that led then to the Yantar heading directly off to the Mediterranean, was of course built in that Barrow shipyard.
Dame Caroline Dinage.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm sure the Secretary of State agrees with me that our Royal Navy and our FA are the best in the world. They need to be equipped with the vessels and the crew to do their job and address the threats like those he's just articulated, and I'm grateful for him for doing so today. He'll know that Portsmouth Harbour, on which Gosport sits on the opposite side, is home to the 6 Type 45s that were commissioned without adequate propulsion units. Could he update us on the T45 power improvement programme? Will it be sufficient for them to be allowed to deploy with the upcoming carrier strike group? And more broadly, what's he doing as part of the SDR to ensure that there's a significant and sufficient proportion of our naval personnel with seagoing liability?
If I may, Madam Deputy Speaker, first of all to say to the Honourable Lady, I am so pleased that she cites alongside the Royal Navy the essential role of the Royal Fleet Auxiliary. They play an essential part in our maritime defence and operations. Second, she asks for an assurance on the Type 45's participation in the carrier strike. I give her that. And if she'd like me to write to her in more detail about the progress with the engine upgrade programme, I'm happy also to do that.
Graham Downey.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I thank the Secretary of State for such a strong statement, and indeed one which makes very clear to Vladimir Putin that this aggression will not be tolerated. Recently, the Minister was kind enough to answer a series of written questions from me on myself on QRA, subsea cables and defence of the High North, all pointing to additional threats from Russian forces and the need for a strong response. With the Strategic Defence Review well underway, how is he ensuring that it is flexible in dealing with these changing and evolving threats to make sure we're also taking lessons, learning from Ukraine and from the recent example of the Finnish ship in the Baltic Sea?
Madam Deputy Speaker, my honourable friend is one of the strongest voices for recognising the way that the High North will become strategically much more essential, where degrees of conflict and contest are likely to grow, particularly as climate change leads to the opening up of the Northern Passage. I just say to him quite simply that if he looks at the terms of reference of the strategic review, if he looks at the work of the review and challenge groups that have been an essential part of that external leadership of this defence review, he will see that the concerns that he raises within the House today are absolutely central to the work of the Strategic Defence Review, and when it is published, I'm sure he will find the evidence of the sort of caution that he gives to the House taken very seriously by the government.
Alistair Carmichael.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The activities of the Yantar may be an escalation, but this is not the first instance of activity of this sort. It's almost 2 years now since I first raised concerns about the activities of Russian vessels in the waters around Shetland. Events in Finland at Christmas show that Russia is prepared to go further, and we must also show that we are determined to meet any challenge of that sort. This is a strategic threat for the United Kingdom as a whole, but it is particularly acute for our island communities that rely on cables for digital and energy connectivity, quite apart from the pipeline serving the oil and gas industry. So will he speak to the energy companies and to his colleagues in the Department for Energy and Energy Security and ensure that our island communities are not left as the soft target for the next escalation in this business?
Madam Deputy Speaker, he's certainly right. This is not the first instance. And indeed, the total loss of digital connection that the Shetland and his constituency suffered in 2022 demonstrated most vividly both the daily life and everyday life dependency on this critical infrastructure and how vulnerable they can be to damage or sabotage. And so I give the Honourable Gentleman, the Right Honourable Gentleman, the assurance he's seeking in the consideration of the Strategic Defence Review and certainly in the implementation. That is exactly the sort of question that will be and the challenge that we'll be meeting.
Mark Stewart.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State for his clear statement today. In addition to that, I also want to thank him for spelling out why it's so important that we protect these deep sea cables. Something like 95% of all international data goes through these cables. It is the backbone of the internet. So given these facts, can the Secretary of State assure us that the protection of this critical infrastructure will be at the forefront of the minds of everybody completing the Strategic Defence Review?
Madam Deputy Speaker, he makes a powerful case. I can certainly give him that assurance.
Alex Shalbrook.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. May I first of all welcome the Secretary of State with his candour. It is absolutely important that the country understands the threats that the nation is under, because estimates are that the economy will lose tens of millions of pounds per hour if there was a data loss, and these cables are absolutely strategic to our national well-being. With that in mind, may I urge the Secretary of State that the government has to explain to the public why we have to keep increasing defence spending in relation to what the consequences would be if it wasn't there. And if that does mean that we move above 2.5% to 3%, 3.5%, that it's not an issue about President Trump pushing that narrative, as many presidents have done before his time, is because that is the strategic requirement that Europe and NATO are going to need to head off what is clearly acts of aggression close to a declaration of hybrid war on NATO, and therefore be absolutely vital that the public understand why defence spending is so important at this time.
Very good. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Right Honourable Gentleman is a leading member of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. He understands better than most in this House the concerns and perspectives of other NATO nations, and he portrays that this morning. On the question of the commitment to increase defence spending, everyone agrees defence spending must rise. The commitment that my party made going into the election well predated the results of the US election. It's a commitment that we're determined to honour, and if it is the case that everyone agrees that defence spending must rise to meet the increasing threats, then there is certainly a lead responsibility for government and government ministers to help explain that to the public. But I would hope that everyone who believes that defence spending must rise can and will play a part in conveying that to the public as well.
Jones.
Madam Deputy Speaker, although out of sight, our offshore infrastructure is absolutely vital to the smooth running of this economy, and any disruption to that would have a huge impact on my constituents in North East Derbyshire. It would be truly catastrophic. Can the Secretary of State assure me, therefore, we will not take the security of this infrastructure for granted, and that we'll make sure that we take the necessary steps to provide that security as part of the SDR?
Yes, Madam Deputy Speaker, I welcome very much my honourable friend's voice from landlocked North East Derbyshire, recognising the fact that this is not simply a concern of maritime communities or islands, but of the whole country, and for all of us in our everyday lives. And I just refer, if I may, to the terms of reference of the Strategic Defence Review, which high up and with specific focus points to the need to review and reinforce the defence of our British homeland, and central to that, in light of our experience in recent months, in light of the rising Russian aggression, the increase in these sort of incidents, that is what the SDR will consider.
Sir Benedict.
Can I thank the Secretary of State for his profoundly important statement, which is immensely reassuring. But can I ask about preemption? We all know that Russia is no respecter of international law, and an overzealous and overcautious interpretation of the legal constraints on the UK armed forces could be very destructive. Is the government refusing to rule out preemptive action against a hostile ship threatening critical national infrastructure, albeit if it lies under international waters? And will he agree that an open mind on preemption is a stronger deterrent than ruling it out?
Madam Deputy Speaker, the right honourable gentleman has a huge experience in this field, so he'll recognise that I simply won't and can't get into responding to hypotheticals. He urges me not to allow undue constraint of perhaps established practices or rules where there is a good case for flexibility, and I hope he will take as a signal of the serious intent that I will bring to this my decision, as I've reported, with the approach of the return of the Yantar to UK waters, my readiness to alter the permissions that the Royal Navy was using, in order that should the captain of the warships we deployed to watch and track the Yantar required, they could go closer, they could see better, and they could determine more carefully what exactly the Yantar was up to. And of course, that was a move like the surfacing of the submarine in November, specifically to deter and to discourage the sort of activity that we simply don't want to see in our waters.
Stephen Centre.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Keeping ourselves safer at home means ensuring that Putin will lose abroad, because when Putin is finished in Ukraine, whenever that may be, he will come for more. And defeating him means showing him we have the resolve and the resources to defeat him in the future. Can the Secretary of State assure me that as part of the SDR we will have a way to combat and indeed prevent and protect ourselves from Russia?
I hope my honourable friend will take the content of my statement, the assertion that the most immediate and concerning threat to the UK it comes from Russia. I hope he'll take the action that I've taken in response to the Russian spy ship, the Yantar, in our waters again, will reassure him that exactly as he urges and the Shadow Defence Secretary has recognised, Russia is a serious menace. It's fighting a war in Ukraine, the first war, full-scale war in Europe since the Second World War, but its aggression, particularly as the Shadow Defence Secretary said, in the grey zone, warned about by the heads of the CIA and the MI6, tells us that this is a regime which is intent on disruption, it's intent of disrupting our way of life, and he is right to start by saying the defence of the UK starts in Ukraine. If Putin prevails in Ukraine, he simply will not stop in Ukraine.
Dave Dugan.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I welcome the Secretary of State's statement and the actions in it that he details to intervene in Russian activity in the waters around these islands. I also commend the diligence and professionalism of those men and women in uniform in the Royal Navy, Royal Fleet Auxiliary and the RAF. He says in his statement, though, that the UK will continue to lead the way on sanctions against Russia's shadow fleet. But the UK isn't leading the way on sanctions, is it? A Sky News investigation last week found out that the government has no record of how many investigations it's carrying out on breaches of Russian sanctions. And this follows a previous investigation which shows the flow of goods, including luxury cars, fossil fuels and items which can be or have their components converted into weaponry, is flowing between the UK and Russia since the beginning of Russia's war in Ukraine. So surely the Secretary of State must be concerned that inaction elsewhere in Whitehall is potentially putting men and women in uniform in the UK's armed forces at risk from Russia's malign aggression.
Well, I certainly don't share the honourable gentleman's assertion about that. And I would simply say to him, I made the argument to him that the UK is leading the way with allies in action to deal with the Russian shadow fleet. And I confirmed to him that we have sanctioned 100 ships that are composed of that loosely networked Russian shadow fleet. And that number is more than any other nation.
Ben Spencer.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for his statement about Russia's activities, which is concerning but of course not surprising. I'm the chair of the APG for the Nordics, and would you agree with me in the importance of close cooperation with our Nordic allies in dealing with this threat? I'm building on the Shadow Secretary of State's comments and broader discussion about transparency and information sharing with the United Kingdom. Before Christmas last year, every Swedish household received the regular pamphlet Krisen eller kriget kommer, so if crisis or war comes. They do this regularly. Is it time for us to look into this?
Hear, hear.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Honourable Gentleman is, and I thank him for the work he does in chairing the all-party Nordic group in this House. I say to him, one of the benefits of all Nordic countries now being part of NATO, of the very close defence and security relationships we have with those countries, is that we can indeed learn from each other. And the not just the new before Christmas approach that the Swedish have taken to the sense that a country is stronger if its society is resilient and its society is recognising that they may be under threat and ready to respond if required. I think there are certainly some lessons for us in the UK as we consider the future and we consider a rising level and complexity of threats that we may face in the years ahead.
Last week, alongside other honourable members and peers in the Armed Forces Parliamentary Scheme, I visited the nation's flagship, the Prince of Wales aircraft carrier. Their commanding officer, Captain Will Blackett, and his team showed us the ship's capability, and we witnessed an incredible demonstration of how they can respond. But when we asked about how they would respond to ballistic missiles, or how this place and other institutions are protected from hostile states, it was a terrifying response, to be fair. Now, I realise, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Strategic Defence Review is ongoing and there's a commitment to get to 2.5%. But with President Trump threatening to pull out of NATO, this isn't enough. What plans does he have to go faster and to put our military retention and recruitment on a stronger footing so our country and our infrastructure is properly protected?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, Captain Blackett and his crew were delighted that the Honourable Lady and other members of the Armed Forces Parliamentary Scheme were able to go on board to be briefed and to look at what an extraordinary piece of British military kit we have. I just would say to us simply that the Strategic Defence Review is set up to examine exactly the sort of points that she raises. It's designed to look at the threats we may face, the capabilities we may need, and the resources available, but in particular, the accelerating way that the nature of warfare is changing, and the central role that an accelerating development of technology is changing both the nature of the threat and the nature of the capabilities that we must develop with allies in order to meet that.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. If Putin's Russia is the greatest threat to peace in Europe, the second greatest threat must be any American decision to turn its back on NATO. So can the Secretary of State assure us that he will be doing everything in his power to convince his new counterparts in the United States administration of the seriousness of the threat that Russia poses?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I don't expect the new administration to require any coaching on the threats from Russia or the threats from and around other parts of the world. I expect this administration to be one that takes defence and security seriously and that recognises that a secure, free, openly trading Europe is in America's very best interests.
Robin Swan.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State's statement says that the response is to strengthen our response to ensure Russian ships cannot operate in secrecy near UK territory. The Secretary of State will be aware of an occasion just over a year ago when a Russian submarine was actually chased from the harbour in Cork by the British Navy because the Irish Navy doesn't have the sonar equipment to detect those potential underwater threats. Those threats for about that 97% of the world's communication internet traffic. Can I ask the Secretary of State what communication or interaction he's had with the Irish Government and indeed the Irish Armed Forces in regards to strengthening our cooperation with them to ensure that the west coast of these British Isles are protected?
Madam Deputy Speaker, we don't and we won't comment on specific operational details like that. Needless to say, however, that we work very closely with the Irish government on such matters, and recently our Chief of the Defence Staff met his counterpart from Ireland.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I commend the Defence Secretary for his statement and for the actions that he has taken, in particular changing the rules of engagement to allow for the closer inspection of this vessel. But he doesn't control all the maritime assets of this country. In December, the Transport Secretary told me that there had been no instances in which this UK has used its agencies to board and inspect bits of the Russian black and grey fleet. None. Zero. Will he speak to his colleagues across government to ensure that we use all the arms of government and its agencies to interdict these unlicensed, unregistered threats to our security?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, where there are grounds for interdiction, then the government collectively, with whatever is the appropriate agency, will certainly be ready to take action. And he will know, having served as a distinguished Defence Minister for some years, that this sort of close coordination and collective action is a feature of the National Security Secretariat that we have at the very heart of our government. It plays and ensures that we can deal with any such threats, any such aggressive activity in the most appropriate way.
Mike Martin.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd like to thank the Defence Secretary and his team and the service personnel involved for the robust response. This is exactly the kind of thing we need when dealing with Russia. The Defence Secretary is also right when he says that the Russian army in Ukraine has been nearly destroyed. But of course the Russian Navy, and particularly the Northern Fleet, which we have to deal with in the UK, is still at strength. So the Defence Secretary has just said a couple of times that Russia is the most pressing and immediate threat to the UK. So in light of these facts, does he still think it's the right decision to send the UK carrier group, which is most of the deployable Royal Navy due to the Royal Navy's size, to the Far East this year for 5 months?
Yes.
John Cooper.
Madam Deputy Speaker, thank you. Undersea cables in the modern era are as vital to this country as the Merchant Navy convoys were in the Battle of the Atlantic in 1942, and they're also equally as vulnerable. Taking shape on the banks of the Clyde at the moment are the Type 26 frigates. They are state-of-the-art. They also have on board them so-called mission bays. We have heard that the Right Honourable Gentleman is fleet of foot and an excellent winner of a foot race today, but we are in an underwater arms race. Can he assure us that he'll do all he can to make sure that those mission bays bristle when the ships take to sea with the necessary underwater equipment to take on this threat?
Madam Deputy Speaker, that is exactly what those interchangeable bays are designed to be and to do and will.
Jim Alistair.
It's very clear that Putin is testing the resolve of the West, and I welcome the rigour of the statement from the Secretary of State today. But the threat to our underground cables is an international issue. Does the Secretary of State agree that the response of the United Nations has been disappointing, and that their Convention on the Law of the Seas is wholly inadequate and indeed out of date in terms of dealing with subversion such as this? And what steps, therefore, are being taken on an international level to get concerted action to protect the underground cables upon which every nation depends?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I think the problem is less with the basic rules of the sea and more with their observance by states that willfully will test the limits or contravene them. And that is why I think the action that I've been able to report to the House in the instance of the Yantar in British waters is exactly the sort of action and the steps that nations like the UK, working with allies, particularly close NATO allies, will continue to take.
And finally, Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State very much for his statement. Nobody could doubt whatever the strength of his words and what it means for us as a United Kingdom to stand firm. And we thank him for that determination and that strong voice that we all support in this chamber. With our naval crew on HMS Somerset being called back on their ship on Christmas Day, the message was clear. The Russians don't take a holiday, but neither do our crews in the Royal Navy. The fact is that the perpetual activity and pressing towards the boundaries by Russia outlines our need for complete preparedness of our Navy. Will the Secretary of State outline whether greater support is needed to ensure that our Navy is at full strength when we consider the fact that our surface fleet is now smaller than that of both France and Italy?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman, and I know the service personnel, not just the crew of the HMS Somerset that, as he quite rightly said, were mobilised on Christmas Day to respond to the Estlig 2 damage, but the 10,000 servicemen and women who were deployed away from home at Christmas. We're grateful for their service. We know they do it to keep the rest of us safe, and we're very grateful.
That concludes that statement. I'll give the Secretary of State a moment so he can walk out and not run out, as earlier on. Martin, before you leave the chamber, you just walked in front of the dispatch box. I suggest you come round and explain yourself. Presentation of Bill, Secretary Liz Kendall.
Public Authorities Fraud, Error and Recovery Bill.
Second reading what day?
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow. Presentation of Bill, Blair McDougall.
Consular Assistance Journalist Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday 7th of March.
Friday the 7th of March. We now go on to the 10-minute rule motion, and I call Miss Julie Minns.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I beg to move that leave be given to bring in a bill to require the provision of audio and tactile measures at polling stations for the purpose of enabling blind voters to vote independently and in secret, to require the Secretary of State to take steps to identify, develop and implement new accessible voting solutions for blind voters, to require the Secretary of State to undertake a review of the arrangements for postal voting in respect of accessibility for blind voters, and to implement any recommendations of that review and for connected purposes. Madam Deputy Speaker, this is an issue that I first began work on in the 1990s. Now, sadly, I am not so young for that work to have been a school project, but rather an excellent campaign led by the disability charity Scope, for whom I had the privilege of working for at that time. Scope's Polls Apart report on the 1997 general election shone a light on the many different ways disabled people were denied their democratic right to vote. From archaic medical approvals for postal voting to steps at polling stations, the barriers to voting and everyday life were and remain very real. The Polls Apart report that I co-authored with my then colleagues Jane Enticott and Nikki Philpott, and informed by the excellent campaigning work of Olivia Marks-Waldman, made a number of recommendations for reform. Indeed, the former member for Nottingham East, Mr John Heppel, presented a 10-minute rule bill, the Disability Discrimination Provision of Voting Facilities, that sought to enact many of Polls Apart's recommendations. What that report found was that a staggering 94% of polling stations surveyed on the day of the 97 general election were inaccessible to disabled people who wanted to vote independently. This led to some being unable to vote entirely, whilst others physically injured themselves trying to open impossibly heavy doors or navigate gates designed without thought for wheelchair users, all in pursuit of trying to cast their right to vote. The report called on the government to review legislation for disabled people and to review Home Office guidance to returning officers with a view to removing the barriers that prevented disabled people from exercising their right to vote independently and in secret. A right that has been enshrined for over 150 years since the Ballot Act of 1872. I am proud of the work that I did for Scope all those years ago, and I would genuinely love to stand before the House today and tell you that all of the issues we identified have been rectified. And many were. But nearly 3 decades on, too many remain. John, in my constituency of Carlisle, has glaucoma, and like many partially sighted people, had difficulty casting his vote in secret at last year's general election. With his guide dog, John headed to the polling station on the 4th of July, where staff escorted him to the booth and read aloud the candidates' names. Because for those who cannot see a ballot paper, it is impossible to read and mark one independently. And with no tactile device provided to enable John to read the ballot paper, he asked the clerk to fold it between the candidates' names and used the fold creases as a guide, relying on his memory to select his preferred candidate. Now, at first glance, this might seem like an adequate workaround, but we must ask ourselves, why should voters with sight loss, like John, have to settle for a situation where they cannot guarantee the privacy or accuracy of their vote, and where solutions are available? John's experience is not an aberration. Across the country, blind and partially sighted voters are still confronted with barriers to voting independently. RNIB's Turned Out report on the 2024 general election revealed that just a quarter of blind and partially sighted people felt the current system allowed them to vote independently and in secret. That same report also found that only half of blind and partially sighted people were satisfied with their voting experience, and 73% didn't know they could request reasonable adjustments at their local polling station. Many blind voters struggle to get the information they need in an accessible format, forcing them to either tell another person their vote or remain disenfranchised. Blind voters report feeling humiliated and let down by the system, having to share their vote out loud in public, and in some cases, not being certain who they voted for. Our democracy is all the poorer for this. That is why this bill seeks to ensure all voters with sight loss are consistently able to access information about the election and candidates independently. And then, when voting, they can, and without assistance, review candidates on the ballot paper, reliably find and mark their chosen candidate, and be in sole control of the secrecy of their vote. This isn't something that is out of reach. Technology exists and the solutions are low cost and effective. For example, tactile overlays that are placed on top of the ballot and combined with an audio recording of the candidate list allows blind voters to easily navigate and mark the ballot paper with autonomy, dignity and certainty. In a recent UK trial, audio and tactile accessible voting solutions enabled 93% of participants to vote independently and in secret. Currently, however, these modest solutions are not routinely available at our polling stations, As it is, the law puts the onus on the blind and partially sighted person to pre-book their vote by making contact with the electoral authorities and requesting specific adaptations, requests that may or may not be granted. The vast majority of blind and partially sighted people do not know these provisions exist or what adaptations to request. The barriers facing voters with sight loss also extend beyond the polling station. That's why this bill also calls for a review of our postal voting system, which many blind voters feel pushed towards because of the inaccessibility of polling stations. However, the same issues around independence and privacy are present. 68% of blind postal voters told RNIB they had assistance from another person to enable them to vote. One respondent told RNIB, "I avoid voting in person because my local polling station doesn't have a clue what to do with me. Now I use postal voting, but I have to rely on my partner completing my form for me, so it's not confidential, and nor can I guarantee they tick the box I ask them to. I just have to trust them." While voting in this country continues to rely on an inaccessible paper-based system, in Australia they have introduced a human-assisted telephone voting model, where a blind or partially sighted person